Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar, Procurement Matters for Charities. This webinar is presented in collaboration between Law Society Pro Bono Services and Singapore Corporate Counsels Association. I am your host and my name is Andrew. First, some housekeeping matters. Today, we will be using Pigeonhole Live for our Q&A session. You can submit questions to the panel of speakers and you can also upvote on any questions that interest you. If you have a smartphone or tablet with you, just launch your internet browser and enter www.pigeonhole.at into the address bar. Next, key in our event passcode, which is procurement. Alternatively, you can click on the link shared in the chat function to launch Pigeonhole Live on your device. If you are viewing this webinar on your desktop or laptop, you should receive an invitation to launch Pigeonhole on your device. You may submit your questions at any point during the webinar, and we will strive to address them during or at the Q&A segment. Please note that the discussion and any material provided in this webinar is not intended to substitute or constitute as professional legal advice. You should consult a lawyer if you require specific legal advice. With that, our speakers for today are Mr. Paul Seah and Ms. Anita Kaur. Paul is a partner at TKQP Advocates and Solicitors, where he has represented clients in some of the largest cases in Singapore over the past decade. Outside of legal practice, he is actively involved in charity work, serving in various capacities on the boards of the Trinity Annual Conference, Metropolitan YMCA, Living Waters Methodist Church, as well as Law Society Pro Bono Services. Now, Anita is a senior manager at Shared Services for Charities, a charity established with the aim of bringing professional services to enhance governance and organizational excellence to charities. At SSC, she works with charity clients to review their internal control structures and establish policy frameworks, craft purpose-driven manuals, offering practical solutions in strengthening governance and controls. Anita has more than 20 years of experience in internal and external audit, governance, risk, and controls. In her past roles in the commercial and not-for-profit sector, she was involved in numerous reviews of not-for-profit organizations, including those under the purview of National Council of Social Service, the Ministry of Health, and the Ministry of Education. Now, thank you, Paul and Anita, for joining us today. Now, to give our audience a sense of what to expect, I will outline what we will be discussing in this webinar. Firstly, we will definitely be covering what exactly is procurement, the importance of procurement, how does one actually develop a procurement policy? How does one demonstrate accountability when audited on procurement matters, common scenarios, and what happens when procurement goes wrong? Now, to kick off today's webinar, let's understand what exactly procurement is. Now, Paul, is there actually a definition of what procurement actually is?
Well, Andrew, if you go on the internet and type procurement, you'll find quite a lot of definitions. I think the one that you see on the slides that we put up is fairly holistic. It says procurement encompasses every activity involved in obtaining the goods and services a company needs to support its daily operations, including sourcing, negotiating terms, purchasing items, receiving and inspecting goods as necessary, and keeping records of all the steps in the process. So for charities, it really is things that you have to buy, goods, services, and the process behind it, how you record it. And this would mean anything from using petty cash to buy stationery at a shop, all the way to how do you conduct a tender if you have a big project. Say you want to use a new IT software, or you need to do some construction in your premises, and procurement encompasses all of that.
So you mean even like really small ticket items, you mentioned stationery, a file, procurement would include things like that. So it's not just limited to the large ticket items a charity would
No, it's not. And this is especially, it happens in every organization that you have to buy things to keep the organization running. But this is especially important in a charity, because no matter how big or small the item is, you're really using public funds. So procurement actually encompasses the entire spectrum.
Okay, so I think Paul just touched on how we're actually using public funds. So Anita, why are actually good procurement practices important in charities?
Yeah, so well, procurement by nature represents an outflow of funds from a charity. And apart from manpower costs, it is actually the largest expense in a charity. And as Paul has mentioned before, charities actually use public funds from donors and grant makers. Therefore, they actually have a duty and a responsibility to demonstrate good stewardship of these funds to the donors and public. And actually, if you have good procurement practices, right, this allows a charity to show that the purchases of items that they make, right, are made in a fair, open, and transparent manner, and they're actually getting good value for money. And one of the other things is that when charities buy, they want to be able to show donors that the monies which have been given to the charity is actually being used for the charity's objectives, which means that items that you buy are in line with the needs of the charities and benefit the beneficiaries itself. So if we have good procurement practices, in a way, we can demonstrate to our donors and the public that the monies which are given to the charities are used in the most appropriate manner to further enhance the objects of the charities. Yeah.
So thank you, Anita, for that. Now that we actually understand, procurement is a very important matter when it comes to charities. I would just like to invite Paul. Could you share how does one actually craft a procurement policy?
Yeah. So I think the starting point is that it's important for every charity to have a procurement policy. Otherwise, you'd be scrambling, right? Every time you need to buy, whether it's a pen or you need to do a big ticket expenditure, you got to figure out what's the right way to get this done. How do we go about? So having a policy that sets this out is important. But again, if you go on the internet and you Google procurement policy, you will actually find many examples of what those policies are, step by step. What kind of tender you need, what kind of budgeting you need. But I think I want to ask everyone to take a step back, because some charities, it's tempting you just take wholesale and cut and paste, right? And copy and paste something that you think is suitable for you. But I've actually found that to have a proper policy, it's always better to start with principles first, and then let the principles drive the practices. So for example, if you say a principle is we should not have conflict of interest, that then drives the practice of saying, if it's a related party, we need to be careful. We need to make sure we get proper tenders, make sure that conflicts are declared to the board. But you may come to a situation where you say, okay, the chairman's friend wants to give the charity a big discount. Is there a conflict? How do we do this? And then you can go back to the principle and go, what is it we're really trying to do to make sure there's competition? Or for example, if one practice in a policy you find is above a certain amount, say $15,000 for a smaller charity, you need to do 3 quotes. Some people might say, hey, let's get around it by breaking up the purchase into 3 times $5,000, so we don't have to get 3 quotes. It's easier for the staff. Don't have to bother the volunteers on the board too much to go through this. But if your principle behind that practice is really to ensure fair competition and getting good value, then you will know that, hey, this can get around the practice or get around the policy, but that's not the right thing to do. So I would say that policy has 2 chunks. You first start with the principle of why you want to set a certain procurement policy, then you begin to populate it with the practices, your actually day-to-day, what goes into the policy.
Anita, how about from your perspective, from SSC's perspective, anything that you've observed or you wish to share when it comes to policy?
Yeah, definitely. I just wanted to add on to what Paul mentioned. So we can have a procurement policy which actually gives you the overarching principles for buying, right? But with this policy that we have, this policy, one of the important things is that it's actually used by employees in practical operations. So employees will rely on the principles and they need good tailored procedures to help them to use this policy to make buying decisions. And the beauty of this policy, it is something that has been established by the board. It provides a framework on how employees must conduct their purchasing activities. The other thing which I wanted to touch on, which Paul mentioned, which is very real in the charity sector, is that we do often see different sizes of charities. And when you want to craft your procurement policy, it's very important for us to look at a couple of factors. So oftentimes, one of the most important considerations is the nature of your purchases, the frequency of your purchases, and the values. So why is this important is because this will drive into what kind of policies and the level of processes that you will have and the approving limits of authority. The other thing which we have to be mindful about is the size of a charity is also very important. Large charities can have more complex purchasing needs. They may have many centers, they may have many departments, and all these centers could be involved in purchasing of different kinds of items. Sometimes you could be centralized, sometimes you could be decentralized as well. And because they are larger, we can say that the value of transactions will be higher. So just by looking at how the charity is set up, who is involved in buying, and what is the value of transactions, we have to use this to determine key factors such as what is our approval limits for purchases, for quotations, or even for tenders. And we also want to be able to look at good guidance for our staff in who to give transactions to. For smaller charities, they usually have very simple, less complex purchasing transactions, and they also have a lean organization structure. So it's good to have a balance in how a small charity would conduct procurement. Their quotation approval limits may be less than a larger charity. They may have simpler approving authorities, maybe 2 levels. Head of departments may approve and larger ones may go to the board itself. In larger charities, you may have the heads approving, you may have the head of organization, we may even go to the board level. So it's really important for you to actually have a look holistically at your charity. What are the nature of services that you have, what you want to buy, what is the frequency and the values in really crafting a good policy that's tailored and works for your organization. Yeah.
Thank you, Anita. So, well, Paul has already touched on how, procurement basically involves pretty much anything you buy for the charity. And Anita, just now you just mentioned that, there's also limits on approvals. We've already had one member from the audience who's asked, how does a charity assess whether buying a branded item is justifiable for a charity? Anita, do you have any experience from actually your audit work where you may have spotted, why is there a branded item amongst goods purchased for a charity?
Wow, I would like to know which charity buys branded items. I think this really goes back to the principles of purchasing, right? What is the purpose of this purchase? How does this item actually enhance the objectives of the charity? How does it serve the need of the charity itself? And what kind of benefit does it give to the beneficiaries? So when we look at purchasing, we do a lot of reviews of purchasing in our clients itself, and we do not adopt a one size fits all. But what we do is put it back to our charities and ask them, you have to be able to demonstrate the need for this branded item. And how would you want to use this? Because again, we come to public perception, which is why a branded item? And could this item could we have another similar item at a different price? And so when there is heightened scrutiny at that level, I think the charity has to take a step back and ask themselves these very real questions in how would you justify such a purchase? It's not that it can't be done, but how would you put this forward and get in approvals from your board and also demonstrate to public when this can be under scrutiny as well? Yeah.
As a follow-up to that question, Paul, our audience did ask, how do you differentiate something that's branded versus something that's luxury? Is there some legal way of differentiating this?
No, I don't think there's a legal answer to that. But just like Anita, I would really like to know what branded item the charity is looking to buy and where the question is coming from. But I think this actually illustrates the point that we were talking about earlier, that the principle must drive the practice. Because this is a question of practice, right? What can we buy a branded item or luxury item as a charity? That's what is our practice. But if you go back behind it and look at the principle and say, look, in terms of procurement principle, one principle might be how to get the best value for money from the market to achieve the aims of the charity. If that's the guiding principle, your practice, you may not cover every single circumstance. So if someone wants to buy branded versus luxury, then you look at your policy, a practice just says get 3 codes. But then you go back to the principle. Is this really a foundational principle? Is this really the best value that we can get using public funds? So that's why I think the principles behind procurement are very important. And I'd like to encourage, the audience who's listening, if the board and the leadership of a charity has not sat down to discuss what are the principles driving the procurement, there's no better time than to do it now, because when these questions come up, you need a bedrock, right? You need sort of a North Star to go back to and say, this is our guiding principle.
Okay, so Paul, you've been mentioning this term, procurement principles. What exactly are procurement principles? Are there like universal procurement principles? Do my procurement principles change just depending on which country I'm from?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think I'll put up 3 examples, and I would answer your question shortly with this. I think there are some procurement principles which are quite universal, and we'll see some of those, and some are more culture or organization specific. So I've given 3 examples here. I hope they'll be helpful to our audience. The first is the Singapore government, and you can get this on the MOF website. And I will say that you look at these, they are fairly universal. They are good principles for a charity to follow. So transparency, your procurement requirements, procedures, evaluation criteria are known to the people that you work with, your vendors, people who sell you stuff. Open and fair competition. Suppliers are given equitable opportunities and access to compete on a level playing field. You treat all suppliers fairly and give them the same information for them to prepare their bids. You do not discriminate in favor of any supplier. And then this is very universal, right, for procurement, especially for charity, value for money. You procure from sources that can best meet your requirements, which offer the best value. And value for money doesn't mean cheapest. It's derived from balance of benefits and costs and basis of total cost ownership. So that is one example, and I think fairly universal. But if you go to the next slide, you will see the United Nations. Again, fairly universal, a bit more bite-sized. Best value for money, we saw that already. Fairness, integrity, transparency, we saw that in the Singapore government. But because it's an international organization, it's this effective international competition. So really, you are not favoring one country or one region over another. For charity, you may not have that international flavor, of course. They look at the interests of the contractor, or the person you work with, and client centricity. How well do they treat the UN as a client? So that's UN. But the next example is interesting, because this is the government of New Zealand. And why I put this up, you'll see that certain things here, they have gone a bit deeper. They have emphasized on more things, and they've also some things which are fairly cultural specific. So they say plan and manage for great results, including things which I think is good for each charity, right? Identify what you need, including the broader outcomes that should be achieved, then plan how to get it. Set up a procurement team, the right mix of skills and experience. As Anita said, different charities, different sizes. A big charity may have dedicated personnel to do this. Most charities don't. Involve suppliers early. Let them know what you want and keep talking. I really like the simple language for this, right? Take the time to understand the market and your effect on it. Be open to new ideas and solutions. Choose the right processes proportional to the size, complexity, and any risk involved. Encourage e-business. So that's very cultural. As a country, they want to encourage e-business. Tender sent by email. It's more environmentally friendly. So as a charity, you want to think of some of these culture-specific things. And then they have something we have seen already, be fair to suppliers. I won't go through all this, but you look at it, they actually break down what it means, right? Make it easy for suppliers to do business, be open to subcontracting opportunities, clearly explain how you will assess proposals. I think that's very important. And then talk to unsuccessful suppliers to see how so they can learn and how to improve next time. Not every charity will do that, but that's very aspirational. Next slide, please. This in New Zealand, get the right supplier. And I think this is great. Be clear about what you need and fair in how you assess suppliers. Don't string them along. So if you're getting 3 quotes just for the sake of getting 3 quotes, but you know which one you want, you got to think about how they want to be open or not, right? Choose the right supplier can deliver what you need at a fair price and on time. And then the other ones I want to pick up is get the best deal for everyone, right? Make balanced decisions, consider the possible social, environmental, economic effects and cultural outcomes. Why I picked this up is because certain charities, if you're a religious charity, for example, might want to, some charities' procurement principle might have something that says, we will not buy from an organization that has certain industries, gambling, smoking. So what I want to say is procurement principles, they are fairly universal principles about fairness, about best value, but there are also some that can be fairly specific to your cultural needs as a charity. But you look at the New Zealand one and the UN one, you can be very broad, but you also can be more specific. But these are just some examples. I think they're good examples. And I want to encourage each charity, if you have not spoken about this before, you have not talked about internally, it's a good conversation to have. And then is these principles that really will then drive the practices and both go together to make a solid procurement policy.
Thank you, Paul, for explaining that about principles. Now, tied to this matter about principles, right? A member of our audience has actually asked, are there actually legislations or regulations that actually govern the procurement practices for charities?
For charities, the exact procurement practices, no, but there are guidelines, right? There are certain things that as a board director or staff, you need to think about. For example, conflict of interest. That's something that every organization needs to think about when you think about procurement policy. You think of the director having to act in the best interest of the charity. So these things are actually set in law, common law as well as statute. And these are the things that, in a sense, form the bedrock of the principles that you need to think about. I mean, there's no law going to tell you beyond a certain price, $10,000, you need to get 3 quotes, or if it's petty cash, you need to make sure someone signs out. Yeah. There's no legislation on that, but the principles, that the bedrock of the principles, there is also the flip side of it, that if you don't do it well, you might fall foul of these laws, these things which are in law, that you have to act in the best interest of the charity, that you have to avoid conflict of interest.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So Anita, I just want to understand. So Paul mentioned this thing about having all the principles. I mean, you've agreed, principles must be the bedrock. But let's say I have my principles charted out after I discuss with my board. How do I then craft this policy? What do I need to put inside my procurement policy now that I have my principles?
Right. Okay, so once you have your principles, the reason why we have a policy is to actually crystallize the principles in a document, right? And you want to be able to share with the staff and management of the charities in how you're actually going to conduct this procurement activities. So when you want to craft a procurement policy, one of the most important things you have to do is look at the breadth of your procurement activities. So a good procurement policy must actually cover all aspects of purchasing, from purchase requisition, from quotation requirements, selection of winning quotations, budget checks, and then the approval to buy. So these are the broad principles that we have to create policies about. And as mentioned earlier before, it really depends on the size of the charities and the nature of your transactions as well. Some of the key areas which I think we've reviewed many procurement policies for a lot of clients that we look at, and we also help them to draft procurement policies. Some of the key areas which we feel needs to be done in a good manner so that the board can actually guide the staff in carrying out procurement activities and then demonstrate stewardship for public funds. One important thing is to have clearly defined approving authority limits, because this clearly defined, we call it a delegation of authority matrix, really tells staff at what level do you need to go to heads of departments or to the CEO or the ED or even to the board level. And this must be really crystallized into a policy document and shared through all staff as well, because many people are involved in purchase requisitions. The other thing which we encourage a lot of our charities is actually to come up with a policy on competitive quotations that actually work for them. So if you are a charity, we have seen small charities which may say that I only need 2 quotations beyond a certain amount. Larger charities may say I need 3 quotations for large purchases. Some of them may even say for smaller purchases, I need 2 quotations. So it's really important for the charity to look at the size of their operations and the value of the transactions and come up with a quotation policy. Because at the end of the day, by having this quotation policy, you will go out and look for quotations for you to compare like to determine which is the best price, which is the best service. And I like what Paul mentioned, again, don't string along your suppliers. So having a policy on having quotation requirement, really, we have to stand back and say, why are we doing this? It's because we want to make sure that we have really sourced for the best item, best quality and best price. And we don't just want to tick the boxes that I've got 3 quotations. So this is something that charities and even everyone involved in procurement should be looking at. The other thing that I think that really needs to go into a procurement policy really is, what if I can't get 3 quotes? What if I can't comply with my policy? What if I really have done everything and I'm not able to demonstrate that I've got enough quotations and I am selecting the right vendor, right? So in these instances, you want to give a policy on waiver of competitive quotations. And when crafting this, which is what we see, some charities have it at a basic level, some do it very well to give clear guidance when we can waive quotations. So it could be there's a sole supplier for this item. This is a specialist procurement IT item, or only one vendor can provide this, or even for emergency services. So for this one, you want to have a policy on what items, if we can't get 3 quotes, then we can go ahead with 1 or even 2. And the beauty of this is that it passes back the buck on the approval to the person who's given the authority to approve. And this person will need adequate justification from the staff, right? Why is it I couldn't get 3 quotes? What have I done to get these 3 quotes? And how can I explain that by producing 1 quote or even 2 quotes will actually demonstrate that this is a purchase that's in line with my needs and good value for money. So I think when we craft a procurement policy, we really have to be mindful about who and what we are buying and exactly how we're going to conduct these activities. And at the back of the head, whenever we do reviews for our charity clients, we deal with people who raise purchase requisitions, and this could be people from any departments themselves. And so they want to have clear guidance on how many quotes do I need to get? And then what should I write when I do my evaluation of quotations? And then who should I send this for approval? And if I can't get, then in which area of this policy does it allow me to go ahead with just 1 or 2? So based on our experience, these are really some of the critical items that we should consider and really put into our procurement policy if you want to achieve the principles we spoke about earlier.
So thank you very much, Anita. So you've shared on what needs to be put into the procurement policy. Now we've got a rather interesting question from a member of our audience here. You talked about the matrix, you talked about approvals, you talked about a waiver policy.
Yeah.
Now, our audience has asked this question. Now, how then do I justify a purchase from a long-time supplier? Is reliability a justified reason to just stick to one supplier?
That's a good question. We do see this quite often. And I think just off the cuff of it, yeah, if you have a long-term supplier who's reliable, of course, that is one of the factors we should be considered when we assess a reason for selecting a vendor. But at the end of the day, you go back to your policy. What does your policy say? And what is the criteria for assessment of vendors? So if it would have a few components, right? So you would look at price, you would look at after-sales service, you would look at reliability, you would look at track records with this supplier as well. So I would say that it is good to have suppliers, long-term suppliers who you're happy with their service as well. But you want to always be able to provide good justifications to someone who's going to approve the purchase that actually I have checked with all other vendors. This person is still long-standing and provides the best quality. And in fact, his price also matches what we want. And here I just want to caveat, doesn't mean that the cheapest price is what we should go for. We also have to assess the quality of the service and who we are buying from, right? Is this a reputable company? Is this someone we want to be associated with? Like what Paul mentioned, what kind of company is actually providing this? So in terms of evaluation, there are a few factors that need to be considered. Again, you want to ask yourself, how would you answer this if someone put it back to you and why you selected this?
Actually, to pick up on that, it's a question that a lot of charities have. And as to be honest, as a charity, but you say you have an IT vendor and you have used the IT vendor all the time, you're comfortable with them, they meet your needs. One of the questions, do you have to then retender every year for the IT services? Or if you're a panel of contractors, let's say you have a lot of construction work and you're very comfortable with them, how does the IT policy work around that? I think, again, you go back to the principles of value for money, of suitability. Every now and then, I think it's important for policy to build in, for the lack of a better word, a circuit breaker, right? So you could go back in and say, this vendor has been with us for a certain amount of time. We need to relook, even though we like them very much. Relook whether they are still up to date. As an IT vendor, you need to, do they have best practices? Is their pricing, is it still in line with the market? Are people out there offering better services, better technology, cheaper prices? If you don't, then, as much as you're comfortable with a supplier, you might slip behind. Doesn't mean you have to keep changing every 6 months or every year, but I think a good policy needs to have these circuit breakers to say that for these long-running services, for these suppliers, recurring suppliers, at a certain point, when do we relook at them, retender, requote, so that we have this built-in mechanism where we're not stuck with something simply because we've used them for a long time. But we go back to how do we get best value, how do we get maximum benefit, and that really is the core of the procurement policy.
Yeah, I just want to add on from there when we're talking about having long standing suppliers. So one of the things which you can actually consider crafting in your procurement policy is how do you deal with vendors who you want to do frequent purchases, or you have, you know that you're going to buy a couple of times from them in a year. And we usually encourage you to establish an approved vendor list, right? So you may have purchases like stationery, or if you run homes or centers, you may have groceries and other home needs as well. So you want to come up with a list of who you can buy these items for. And the way to do it is like at the beginning of the year, you can put out quotations from various like stationery suppliers or grocery suppliers, right, to get their price list and do a comparison. So if your policy says 3 quotes, you would get 3 quotes, and then you will evaluate the quotes that come in. And then just by looking at the quotations itself, you may select 1 or 2 vendors that for 1 year, I will go ahead with this vendor, and that anytime I want to buy from this vendor, I wouldn't need to do the quotation requirement because I've pre-qualified them at the beginning of the year. But like what Paul mentioned, it's not a perpetual blanket approval. So you got to look at it at maybe 6 months or 1 year is a good time frame for a lot of charities, is look at it again and do an assessment. And when we say assessment, is the quality of the service. Have we done checks outside in the market whether the price is still competitive? Has this vendor consistently served us and give us our after quality sales? Are they always available on time for their supplies? So you want to do this evaluation at the end of the year on any approved vendors and re-qualify them the next year. And we always encourage our charity clients to do this exercise as a discipline, so that you are also assured that if there are new players in the market offering good prices, then they have an opportunity to provide you good prices and good services as well. So I would suggest if you have frequent purchases, then consider having a systematic approach to managing these suppliers through pre-approving them and then reviewing the service quality as well.
So Anita, if I understand you correctly, so you're saying that, let's say if I have a preferred long-time vendor, as long as I've pre-qualified this vendor, is it actually all right for me to forego, let's say my procurement policy says 3 quotations for every purchase?
Yeah, so this one is looking at a different phase of it. So you're looking at qualifying frequent purchase vendors. And so we go through a different process itself. Instead of each time we buy, we get 3 quotations, but we get a quotation on a holistic basis. So, you could get a list of supplies from a grocery that says these are the items. It may fluctuate within a certain amounts, but generally you'll be around this price. And you may want to say that, all right, from this person, supplier A and supplier B, they look quite reasonable. They're always on time. They are always able to meet last minute needs. And therefore I go ahead. So if the purchase is such time sensitive that I want to buy, I can't wait for 3 quotes all the time, then this is something that you want to consider. But the way to get around it is I've done a qualification in the beginning of the year, maybe 6 months or at the year end, I am going to do a formal review and approval process. And a lot of times when you do the evaluation, it's a systematic thing, there's a form, and you have to give to the buying departments and the users to assess the quality. And once they have done that, a lot of charities may even take this list and give it to the board. This is the list of suppliers that I am going to engage in next year. And I've done my assessment and I'm happy with the results at it. So that gives the board the opportunity to know that I've got all these frequent suppliers and maybe 50% of my purchases are covered by these suppliers, and the others I go through a quotation process. And if it's larger, then it's tender. So it's really managing your frequent purchases and to help operationally. People don't want to say every time I need to get 3 quotes, it's time consuming. And then you end up in situations where you're not able to get it. And then what? Yeah.
So just moving on from the procurement policy, right? I understand that, charities actually get audited. So if my charity is actually audited on procurement matters, how does my charity actually demonstrate accountability, Anita?
Okay, this is right up what we usually do for our clients. So I would suggest that whenever you have an audit, we like to encourage our clients to take it in a positive way, which means that you are reviewing your policy and identifying that any areas in your policies which may not be clear, and you may see certain areas where you can't achieve full compliances. So whenever there are non-compliances with the policies, which the audit will highlight, like you're not able to get 3 quotes, you didn't get the right approving authority, then it's time to get justifications from your staff on why we couldn't comply with this. And is there room for clarity in our policies? And is there something that's not in my policy that I need to address? One of the ways that you can really demonstrate accountability is have a policy that you have crafted. This policy must be approved by the board. It has to be communicated to the staff. If there's training needs to explain to staff how to implement the policy, that should be done as well. And the other things when we look from an audit perspective is really good documentation and record keeping of all our purchasing transactions. So if you have got 3 quotes and your policy gives clear guidance to have a form to evaluate your vendors, you want to have this form properly kept, and you want to have the quotations supported with it as well. So we want to make sure that we are able to demonstrate to people what are the documents that we have used, where are the approvals that support the purchases that we have made itself. Yeah.
So touching on this matter about accountability as well as having the right practices, right? Especially for record keeping, Anita, we've got someone from the audience asking, for small charities, they don't have the benefit of a large, e-platform, something easy to record all the quotes. So the small charity wants to understand, how then do they ensure that they are sufficiently transparent and open when they are sourcing for the vendor? How do they prove this?
Okay. So I guess the question comes to is, what is your existing practice? And if you are having forms, which a lot of charities actually have forms now, but the forms can be in a shared drive or email, right? So you complete the forms and then you get the necessary approvals. And after that, you would put it in a centralized location to demonstrate all the approvals and the evaluations. So I would say it doesn't matter how you want to record. What's important is that you actually do it and you are able to reproduce it if necessary. And at the end of the day, it's how you're channeling this approval, right? So I may write in an we do see charities which you may not have forms, you write it in emails. That's perfectly acceptable if it meets your requirements. If you're small and you don't have many purchases, you can manage emails. But what if you have hundreds, thousands of transactions? How are you going to cope with this email? Where is it going to be kept? Who is going to be the custodian? These are the questions that they need to ask themselves. So oftentimes what we see is there is a purchase requisition form, there is a quotation evaluation form. And the beauty of this form is it really gives staff a structure. What do I need to, what form I need to look at, what I need to complete, who do I need to give it for approval? And at the end of the day, they want to digitize this process entirely and then put it in their OneDrive or shared drive. It's entirely up to them. Our proposition to them is to just make sure that it's there and it's done, and you're able to produce it if someone wanted to have a look at it at the end of the day.
So Paul, I was just thinking, what if this small charity, for example, it decides I will use a call. I'll do calls to do my quotations because calls are faster, right? You ring, press dial a few numbers, someone picks up the phone, you get the value of whatever you wish to purchase, and done. I can decide really quickly, as opposed to typing emails, waiting for a response. Is it actually all right to just call?
I think going back to what Anita said, right? Ultimately is how do you demonstrate to a third party? Say one of your donors looks in, wants to say what has happened to the public money. One of your grants, someone has given you a big grant, wants to say what happened to the grant. And you say, oh, well, we called a few people. You might well have, but it's the recording which is important. And I know working with charities, big and small, and with our dear hardworking staff, sometimes it's a real pain, right? It's a real pain to record, but it is important. And I found that usually what is important is to have what I call procurement champion, someone to understand what the policy and principles are here, and that helps a lot. And that person needs to know, at the drop of a hat, what kind of approval is needed, and then what kind of recording is needed. So even if you call for 3 quotes, follow up with an email and say, we spoke and this is how much you've said. So, and your procurement champion can then put all this together. So when someone actually comes knocking and goes, hey, what happens to the big grant that we gave you, this foundation gave you? You can say, well, we got 3 quotes, we called, but we followed up over email. So that last step of recording is important. And I don't need to, I think I'm not going to get us to go back to the very first slide we saw, but when we define procurement, I'm sure everyone noticed that part of the definition for procurement is also the keeping of proper records of what you have bought and your approval process. And that's very key, especially because it's public money.
Well, I just wanted to add on onto this topic of having verbal quotations. So, a lot of times, like what you mentioned, small charities may find it challenging. So they pick up the phone and they get a quotation. That's perfectly fine, like what you mentioned. But when we come in and we look at audits, some of the reasons which we have heard is, well, I forgot to write it down, or I emailed it and I didn't retain the email, or another one of my colleagues has left and this person has all the emails or has written it in pieces of paper that we can't find. So we're saying that it's perfectly fine for you to record it in whatever manner is proper for you. I have 2 suggestions here. One is, let's think about the person who's actually approving the purchase that you are raising. Because if you filled up an evaluation form and you gave 1 quotation and 2 you wrote, you have no quotations, you just put call person A and person B and you put the price there. Will you be able to explain to this staff, to your boss, that I made a call, and how much credibility will just writing a statement on the price there be? So you want to be able to also support the person which is approving the purchases, because this person is ultimately going to be accountable for the funds that's coming to the charities. And that goes back to exactly why we have principles, because it's not just one person doing it, there is a chain. And ultimately, when we approve the procurement, we are saying that we have complied with all the policies and that we're getting value for money. The other thing which I wanted to say is that we don't want to end up in a situation where documentation may not be around, especially if it's critical purchases. And we really hope that when we say verbal quotations, you set a limit that's acceptable based on your risk appetite, right? So you wouldn't want to have verbal quotations for purchases up to 10,000, maybe I might say, if I'm very small, I say, okay, up to 300, 500 or 1,000, verbal is fine. But beyond that, we want to have a bit more structure and written quotations. So I would suggest to think of it again, really realistically in terms of what we are trying to achieve and how we're going to support demonstrating that we have good practices itself.
So, thus far, we've already talked about some practical challenges that charities actually face. We've talked about being unable to get a minimum number of quotations, verbal quotations instead of written quotations. Anita, any other challenges you've observed from your experience of handling audits, anything that you have been shared with you from charities?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to touch on this one other thing. So we have a procurement policy which tells us how to buy items, but there's another section which we have seen in some of our clients is that people may buy items and claim reimbursements. So what happens is that I may go out and make a purchase with all good intent and purposes because of urgency, and I know that I can get a good value, and I buy this item and I come back and I put in a claim reimbursement. There's nothing wrong with it as long as you've got a good reimbursement policy that guides staff on what can I claim reimbursements on, what kind of value. So you may want to say things like trainings. Trainings are usually you sign up online and you pay. And so after the staff has got approval to do this transaction, they can come back and put in a claim for pay. But we don't want to end up in a situation where we have seen such things when your reimbursement policy is not clear, that the item that I'm buying for reimbursement is large value and it's more than the quotation requirement. So I may say my policy is $1,000. I need 3 quotes. And here we are seeing reimbursements that are made by staff, which is 2,000 and 3,000 and 4,000. And we don't really have a policy. So staff is not clear, and the staff may think that, well, I'm doing it on my own goodwill. I've got this price. Again, when we look at such transactions, we wouldn't say it's wrong, but you need to come up with a policy to guide. And if we are buying items, staff are buying items and claiming reimbursement, then comes up to the question that, is there the perception that we are circumventing our procurement policy? Because if something more than 1,000, I need 3 quotes. But on the other hand, I can go ahead and buy just one item. How do we demonstrate that we have obtained the right price and that this is the right vendor for us? So we do want to make sure that we have a reimbursement policy that's really for staff reimbursement transactions, and everything else should come through our procurement policy itself. So I just wanted to share that this is something that we have seen. It's not normal, but also it is an expense out of the organization itself.
So now that we're talking about challenges, right? A member of the audience has asked, challenge faced, how do you actually safeguard both your charity and a volunteer if the supplier happens to be the volunteer in the organization?
It happens all the time. and it's not a bad thing, because a lot of times volunteers want to help the charity, and it could be anything from someone who owns a grocery shop that donates things or sells things at a much cheaper price, or someone who does IT services, giving IT services for a charity at 50% off. But we go back to what we were talking about just now, which is what are the pitfalls, right? And conflict of interest is one that we mentioned. What exactly is a conflict of interest? A conflict of interest is where a member of the board or staff has torn interest. So you can be acting in the interest of the charity, in a sense here, trying to get the best value for the charity, but also acting in another company's or another person's interest. Here, I can make some profit, I can make some money. So for my other business. So what is the best way to deal with conflict of interest? Maybe not the purpose for this talk, but have a conflict of interest policy as well. When there is a potential conflict, what do you do? And for a lot of boards, you have a policy that says you declare and get some other people to approve it, right? That the person who has a potential conflict doesn't vote, doesn't make the decision. But when it comes to the procurement side of it, and this happens fairly often, you need to go back to your principles. If it's open and fair competition, and a volunteer is a supplier, and you know that there's a potential conflict, all the more so your policy needs to be very sound and say, in this situation, we still need to go out and get quotes. And I think especially so, right, when there is a potential conflict, the procurement practice needs to protect the charity from this kind of issues. So you need to make sure that you have really gone out and gotten the best value, especially when it's a volunteer or staff member or board member that is the vendor on the other side.
So linked to this question, Paul, typical situation. You got 3 quotes in, but then you realize, oh no, one of the quotes is from my friend. This is actually the cheapest one. Can I award them this?
So this again goes back to the conflict of interest policy. And, you know, it's for some charities, I say conflict of interest policy, you might think, wow, that's another impediment, another pain to scratch our head and give us a headache. But if you think of this scenario, that actually helps you because you get good value. You don't have to just drop it because it's a related party or a conflict. If you have a proper conflict policy that says, okay, potential conflict, you go to the board, for example, the conflicted party is not allowed to vote or make the decision. That buck gets passed to independent board members who are not in a position of conflict of interest, who vote, and then they make a decision based on your normal policy, your normal principles, best value for money, reliability, suitability, etc. And then that way the charity is actually protected and can make use of the cheapest quote. So really having good policies, while painful, they're actually stepping stones for a charity to really get the best benefit it can get through procurement, through decision making.
So again, linked to this friend giving a quotation kind of scenario, Anita, we have a question here, which is, if the chairman's friend would like to give a big discount, how do you actually administer this?
I think this actually comes back to what Paul has been talking about, is conflict of interest. And actually, I wanted to highlight this. The Code of Governance for Charities actually has a section that says that you must have a conflict of interest policy. So when we talk about conflict of interest, it's not avoid any possible situations of conflict. It's really managing that conflict. And when we talk about managing conflict, it's putting in place safeguards. So one is to declare that you're in a conflicted position. And the second is to not take part in the decision-making process. So back to your question, Andrew, you mentioned that the chairman's friend has given us a good discount. So discounts are always welcome in a charity. I mean, we want to create best value for our operations itself. But if you want to manage this conflict, then the conflict lies with the chairman, and the chairman can suggest, but it goes back down to staff when evaluating the quotation. You want to inform the approver that this chairman has recommended this. Chairman is conflicted. He declares that he's not going to be involved in the procurement process. He's not going to be involved in the pricing that's given. And we operate based on our procurement policy. So we will get 3 quotes. We will ascertain whether the prices are fair. We will do our justification. We will float it up to the level of approving authority. And if it is due that the quality and the price given by the chairman's connected company is fair, then by all means, if this has been assessed to be the case, it doesn't prevent you from operating or from buying from the organization itself. You just need to manage the position of conflict itself.
So one more question here before we move on to our scenarios. Is there any issue? Let's say I'm a small charity. I don't have a lot of staff, but I do have a finance department. Is there actually any issue if the finance department is the one that handles procurement matters?
I think Anita's probably more expertise, but from my experience, it doesn't matter who does it, so long as you have a procurement champion, meaning somebody eyeballs and knows what the policy is and is able to match the practice day to day with the policy. It could be, your charity could have 3 staff,
exactly,
right? And it just one person has to do it, right?
Yeah.
Someone, but the most important thing is someone keeps track of what the policy is and keeps the proper records.
Yeah. I just like to add from a practical perspective when we look at different charity sizes, right? So if you're small, you may find that the procurement champion could be yourself. You could be the staff who's making the purchase requisition, and it's your duty to go and get the 3 quotations to justify to your head why you're buying this thing. And therefore, you become the person who's tasked with making sure that it's good value for money. I've complied with all the good principles. But if you're in a larger organization and they have the benefit of finance department keeping an eye on your procurement transaction, then that works as well. And the finance head or one of the finance staff can also look at all buying patterns, and they will review any requisitions that come from other departments to make sure that you've complied with the policy. They will check, have you got your 3 quotes? If you haven't got the 3 quotes, have you got the necessary waiver? They even check that you've got the approval from the right person, because sometimes when we are staff, we can't remember, do I go to my head for this limit or do I go to ED or CEO? So procurement, so finance can act as a gatekeeper by helping management to do this kind of checks. And that's really good in larger organizations. Some of our clients that we have seen, which are really small, it is a bit more challenging when the staff have to make sure themselves. And that's where it comes back. They have to be very well aware of what's in their policy. The policy must be very clear so that if I have 3 staff are doing purchasing, they all consistently apply my purchasing policy, and we do not have different interpretations by them. And then you end up with inconsistent practices, and then comes to the issue of, am I really in compliance with what was established by the board? Yeah.
Yeah, I want to add to that to say there's so much wisdom on that in having that consistency and everyone being on the same page.
Yeah.
And you flip it the other way, it also helps you to run efficiently and with less stress to your staff, your board, your volunteers. Because I've seen charities where there's a confusion on who actually approves what. And every time a procurement needs to be made, well, you have to dig up the policy, or people gets called. Someone says, can you approve this? Not my level. Can you get someone else to approve it? And it wastes a lot of staff time and energy. Or the other way around, if the approver might be head of department plus treasurer of the board, and your bank signatory is just supposed to approve it online or sign the check, but that person doesn't know and then starts looking at all the background documents instead of, the bank signatory's role might be just to look that the proper approvals are given. But if he or she doesn't know, you might end up digging out every single email, the whole thread, before approving any single signature, right? So that causes more stress and more confusion. So actually having that proper policy to say who does what at what point, who approves, who signs off the checks, who logs on to the bank app to give approval, and what each person's role is, really makes it less stressful for charity. And in charity sector, people move around, right? Your staff change, your finance department changes, your volunteers definitely change all the time, your board members change, your signatories change. So without that proper lines of responsibility drawn, every time there's a change, you get a headache. So I fully echo what Anita has said. Small charity or big charity, different practices, but the important thing is to make sure that you document what those practices are.
Yeah.
When you're talking about approval just now, right, you were mentioning who's going to make the final call. So this is exactly one of the questions from a member of our audience. Who actually makes the final call on quotations? The procurement department, the requester, the board? Who?
It goes back to policy, right?
Exactly.
So maybe the question is, how do we even decide in the first place? Well, it starts off with, I think, the board and the leadership of the organization sitting down, and this could be board and senior management, or board plus senior management plus finance. Or if you're a very small charity, all your staff and your lead volunteers sit down and say, what are the principles? And then what are the practices? And when you talk about practices, it's really answering these questions.
Yeah.
Say at $10,000, who approves? At 20,000, at 30, at 100,000, and different sizes, as Anita keeps saying, different charities of different sizes have different practices. But those practices are policy decisions made by the board, and I find it important actually to have lead staff in to give their input as well. But once they're set in place, then the rest flows from there. You always go back to the policy. You may find along the way that your policy is outdated. For example, your charity used to be very small. Anything above $10,000, you need 2 quotes or 3 quotes. But now your turnover is $10 million a year. You regularly make purchases of over 100,000. Then you need to go back to the policy, rethink it. Right? The principles may remain the same: good value, fairness, transparency, but the practices change because the charity has changed in size or in nature. So the policy is not set in stone. You can go back to the leadership to rethink, but the answers to those questions, what do you do day to day, are really spring from the policy. So it starts from there, and then it unfolds.
I just want to add on a bit here, Andrew. So we view the policy as a living document. So the policy really crystallizes the tone at the top, right? What does the board want in its purchasing policy? And a lot of times what happens is that the policy is crafted, is written, is approved, and then we put it in a filing cabinet somewhere or keep it in our shared drive. And then it just disappears along the way because people know what they're doing and they follow. But like what you mentioned earlier, Paul, when people leave, when we have change in board members, that's when we can't remember what it's supposed to be. And we may continue practices that may not entirely be in alignment with the policy. And so because this policy is a living document that actually compiles all the principles and the know-how and the how-to for staff, right? It's important that there is a regular process to review your policies. So when you write your procurement policy, you should actually determine with your board how often you want to review this. We usually recommend every 3 years. You may want to update, have finance look at it every year and see if there's anything that's changed, but do a thorough review of your policy once every 3 years and make it be an item in your policy that this policy shall be reviewed once every 3 years, and the review shall be led by, if you have a treasurer or finance committee chair, by that person, so that you keep your policy up to date with practices. And it's not just that the charity size may increase, you may have different kind of transactions. You may actually process your purchasing transactions in a different way itself. You may have now digital payments or you buy from e-platforms, and those may not be in your policy. So doing a review actually keeps your policy up to date. And oftentimes we see that actually the charities have really good practices. They are managing all their purchasing well, managing conflicts, recording everything. But when we take the policy is 5 years old and hasn't moved with the practices itself. So a lot of times when we look, one of our suggestions to them is, why not look at your policy and update it as well? Yeah.
Thank you. So we've actually prepared a couple of simple scenarios that charities may actually face in the course of their daily operations. Charity A needs to actually purchase a large quantity of groceries as part of their monthly charitable activities for the less fortunate. One of their donors actually states that for this month, they can offer a price that's far lower than Charity A's regular suppliers could ever offer. And the staff in charge actually knows this to be true, and he decides, no, I'm not going to follow Charity A's procurement policy, and I'll just purchase from the donor. Anita, is this actually all right?
I think we discussed this a bit earlier. So it's really good to have good discounts, right? And to have good standing relationships with donors that want to help us. But again, when we have a policy, we want to be able to demonstrate that this price is really the lowest price. And therefore you want to have, if you need comparative quotations, you want to have quotations for you to be able to compare. And so it's a tricky thing. I would say that you need to go back to your policy and see what are the quotation requirements. And if it is true that you get other quotations or you know other suppliers, what their price ranges are, then you need to be able to justify in your purchasing decision why you're selecting this donor as well, and give enough information to the person approving the transaction so that they are aware. And if they want more scrutiny to be done, they can. I mean, if I'm an approver, I may ask who is this donor, and what makes our cost compelling to him that he wants to offer this. I would want to understand where this person is coming from, and also just to cover all bases that I am dealing with someone who genuinely wants to provide a proper price for the charity. But I would say go back to the policy and good principles, and if you need quotations to justify to yourself, then please go ahead and do that.
And I think this is where what Anita said earlier about the policy being a living document, and also the need to have a proper policy statement for waiver, right? If you have faced this for the first time and your policy doesn't state, hey, how can we waive the 3 quotes? Then you have a bit of a problem. In that case, maybe you have to go back to the board and then try to say, the board always has the power to say, well, okay, it depends. Sorry, the policy is set by the AGF, the general meeting. Then maybe you can't deviate. You have to go back to AGM. A lot of cases, the AGM devolves the power to the board to set policies, and the board can say, okay, in this case, we waive. But that shows the importance of the policy as a living document. Then you can go back and say, next time we better have what Anita talked about, which is a
waiver.
waiver
Yeah.
policy. And then for waiver policy, it's easy, right? You follow that. Okay, let's say a waiver says if the price is very low, you can't get proper quotations. How do you determine that that price is actually lower? And if all this is determined, you can waive the 3 quotes. Then you're covered by the policy, right? But if you're not covered by policy, then I think you need to think two things back to the principle. How do we make sure that there's no conflict? How do we make sure that there's really best value? And then who do we ask to waive if we have no waiver in the policy? Is it the board? Is it the general meeting?
Yeah.
Who is it that set the policy in the first place?
Yeah.
So Paul, assuming like we forgot to insert the waiver policy, I'm working for Charity right now, and the donor then says, I'll give it to you for another half a year. It's so advantageous to the charity. Can I, in my own judgment call, decide, okay, there's no waiver policy, but this is such a good offer. Can I just decide, skip the procurement policy again?
Yeah, so for all the staff out there, please don't. Because it may seem like a good decision on the day, but imagine 5 years later, someone who gives you a grant or donor or the COC comes knocking your door and says, hey, there's some problem with procurement. We spotted some problems with this charity or maybe with this donor. Let us see your papers and your procedures to make sure that you have gotten the best price. And you have nothing there, right? And it may not even be you. It may be, you may have gone on to another charity, you may have retired, it may be staff, 2, 3, 4, 5 staff down the road, and they can't find anything, right? So I would say in a situation like this, from a practical perspective, it goes back to the question, who set the policy? And if there's no waiver mechanism in the policy, go back to the body that set the policy and then explain and say, can we get a waiver? So if the board has set the policy and the board actually has the power according to the constitution of the charity or the AGM has given the board power to tweak policy, the board can actually vote and say, we accept this, we accept your explanation as a staff, we like this, and we waive the need for 3 quote. Then you'll be covered. Then it will be a proper decision made by the body that actually made the policy, the body that has that principles in mind. So that's important. And it might see one extra step to jump. And sometimes donor management is difficult. They might be thinking, hey, I'm giving you such a big discount out of the love of my heart for your beneficiaries, and you don't want to take, right? You make me jump through all these hoops. That's when I think that donor management is important. To get someone to sit down and say, we really appreciate this, but this policy is also important because it protects the charity. It also protects the donor from accusations of conflict of interest. So some hoops to jump through, but the short answer, don't do it. Yeah, if it's against policy and simply because it seems like a good thing to do.
So, what if like after 3 months of accepting this vendor, I'm handling the procurement again, just by chance I find out, oh no, this donor company that's providing us with these really good value groceries is actually owned by one of the board members, owned by the family of the board members. What should I do now? It's a bit awkward, isn't it?
Yeah, that's an awkward situation. I must say, I've not come across that. That to me sounds like a failure of conflict of interest policy, right? Because these things better declare upfront than find out later. But if you do find out later, I'll say immediately go tell your superior, or if you are in charge, go tell the board, and then try to get it ratified and waived. Or the board might then decide that awkward, right? We might decide to cut links with this supplier or retender. But I think don't keep it, whatever it is, don't sweep it under the carpet. Better late than never.
Yeah. I think I just wanted to add on here is that, that's why we come back to initially, like, who is this donor and why would they want to give us this kind of prizes, right? So you just want to do a bit of your own due diligence checks. At the end of the day, if there is a conflict position, then you also want to protect your directors, right? So if the directors are well aware of the conflict of interest policy and there is a perceived breach of perceived conflict of interest position, right? So you want to be able to know what can you do in such situations. If let's say this director wasn't involved in approving transactions, then that's okay. So we come back to that. okay, she wasn't involved in the approval of the purchases, but you want to highlight to the board that now we are transacting with a company in which she has an interest. And we also want to educate our vendors, right, that actually if you do have a position of conflict, you should also highlight to us, because then we can manage the conflict on our end itself. And I think a lot of times when we buy, it's not you can't invest that much time to check who's the owners of different companies itself. And therefore we want to be a bit more diligent about who is offering us a good price, why do they want to do this. And we also come back to that, we come back to the principle of engaging with people who we know who are genuine and who want to offer prices that are good to us. So it could just be sometimes it's just a rationalizing thing. And some approvers may just say, well, I want to know who is this person. I want to introduce him to another organization or something like that. So I would say it's not uncommon, but it's really come back to managing the conflict again. Yeah.
So moving on to the next scenario that we've actually created here. Charity B, they need to purchase furniture as part of their charitable activities for the less fortunate. However, despite their best efforts, Charity B has not been able to secure 3 quotations as stated in their procurement policy. In fact, only one company has actually provided a quotation, and the price quoted is high. What should I do now, Anita?
I would say go back to your procurement policy. If it says you need to get 3 quotes, then have you done enough to obtain these 3 quotes? Did you prevent or set yourself up for failure if you only gave vendors 2 days or 3 days to provide a quotation? And if you need to increase the window to allow them to provide you with quotations, then you should do that. Because I always come back to the principle of the person who's approving and managing our boards, right? Because what would we justify to them that we are not able to get quotations? And if you look at these transactions, is furniture. Furniture is not a unique item that we may not be able to get 3 quotations or however many number of quotations. So I would say we go back to the principle. If we need to do more to get the 3 quotes, especially if these are not specific or highly specialized items, we should try to get the quotations so that we make sure that we have good value for money. Yeah.
So from a non-procurement policy basis, but just very practical, this is quite a common scenario, right? May not be furniture, maybe other to find items. But I want to encourage charities to do 2 things. One, tap on the board. There might be a lot of people on the board with connections or what we say in dialect, kang tao. Basically, they will know people, they will know, and so tap on the board as staff. Don't be afraid to because the board are volunteers, they're there to help the charity.
Yeah.
Don't be afraid to send out an email or ask to say, hey, we have problem getting 3 quotes, can you help? But the other thing that I found very useful is having a network with other charities. So events like this are great, and hopefully one day we can all meet in person. But having that network of staff from other charities, board members from other charities, to be able to pick up the phone and go, hey, we need this for procurement, and we know you guys have done something like that. Who are some good contacts that you can get? And you'll find that actually there's a wealth of information, a repository of wisdom among the charity sector. So those are the 2 things I would encourage charity staff and volunteers to do.
So let's say right now the charity, all right, because they had difficulty getting the quotations, they expanded the quantity of furniture they wanted to purchase. They widened their search for suppliers, as Anita has suggested. And finally, I succeeded in getting 3 quotations. But because of the value of the furniture, the board member actually has to sign off the purchase. Because I had to spend so much time getting quotations, I'm short on time. I think I'm just going to split this purchase into multiple invoices so that the board member now does not need to sign because the value now falls under the threshold required. Should I do this?
No. I mean, this is clearly splitting purchases, right? And we are circumventing the established approval authority. So I would say the hard answer is no, because when you add up the transactions, it's going to be very clear that it's done within a short time frame, and therefore it is very clear that you're not following procurement principles. And this really isn't the messaging that should be going out. We have seen some charities which may end up in such situations, not deliberately, but it may just it's what we would say poor planning in purchasing. So my center buys this item in January, and then in March I buy another item, and then in April another one. But if you look at it cumulatively, and if you're going to bulk buy and it's across different time frames, why not put it all together, get bulk discounts, get value for money, and then go ahead and get an approval at one go, rather than each center raising different purchase requisitions. So I would say for this is clearly splitting purchases, which is a big no. But if you look at the reason why I'm doing it, or what could cause if it's not deliberate, then do good planning for your purchases, because it helps operationally. It's very tedious to always get quotations, raise requisitions, and do evaluations of quotations as well. So something to consider for charities in planning for common purchases within a short time frame.
And that, I mean, that's a reason also why we say principle goes before policy, practice, right? If practice is the question of how do we do this, how do we do procurement, principle asks the question, why do we do it? And the why has to drive the how. So why do you need board approval for a certain amount? Because if it's very material and it's a large chunk of the charity's budget for the year, then you want to make sure that at large amounts you have proper oversight, so that you avoid a situation where such a large amount can be spent in a way that doesn't match the vision of the charity, or not enough oversight is shared. You want more minds, more wisdom to think about whether this should be done or not. So if you then split up a large amount to smaller amounts, the how you can tick. It's according to policy, right? Because instead of 100,000, it's 3 times 33. So it's under the limit. That you can tick the policy, but the why doesn't get achieved, which is the oversight of a large amount of expenditure. So that's why we go back again, right? That the staff and the volunteers who are part of the procurement matrix or framework not only need to know the how, but it's important to educate, especially new board members, new staff coming in, of the why, which is the principles that drive the procurement practices.
So just moving on to something really quick. Paul, you mentioned this thing about oversight. What actually happens? So let's say for me, I'm working for a charity. What happens if the charity fails to demonstrate accountability in its procurement because of me? Let's say I decide to split invoices. Are there potential penalties the charity could face? Any impact suffered by the charity? Could I face personal liability? Or could I actually result in the board of the charity actually facing personal liability?
Okay, there's a whole range. So I've advised charities where the COC comes knocking on the door and says, after an audit, we noticed that there's this transaction that looks a bit like a conflict. Then it takes a lot of work from the board and the management to explain why it's not. Or if it is, why even more work to try to piece it together. So two little mistakes by staff or by board or bad procurement policy can lead to a whole world of extra work. But that is the tame or not so serious part of it. The more serious part is, for example, you don't have a proper procurement policy, and the board decides we're going for a board retreat in a luxury hotel somewhere, and all of us are going to fly SQ first class. What happens if a donor finds out? And we've all seen this in newspapers, right? Things have happened to charities in the past without a proper procurement policy, where 1 or 2 people decide everything, or staff decides, a CEO decides that for long service award for all the senior staff, including herself or himself, everyone's going to get either a luxury watch or Hermes bag. So without a proper procurement policy, without oversight, on the less serious side, it can cause a lot of problems when an audit comes. On a more serious side, you could actually end up with misspending of public funds, and that's really what you want to avoid.
Is that a criminal offense?
Where I'm not sure whether we want to go. It depends on how bad it is, right? I have unfortunately represented charities where lack of controls have led both to civil, meaning non-criminal lawsuits, but also criminal lawsuits, where a lack of conflict or controls or procurement can lead to fraud. And it's a serious matter. And some charities which are quite large have actually large sums of public money coming in. And especially at that stage, you need to be very careful. But it doesn't only mean big charities need to be careful. Like, not everyone will be stealing $5, $10, $20 million.
Yeah.
It could be someone just dipping the petty cash and taking $10 every day. And without the proper procurement policy, you could lead yourself into that situation.
Well, okay, we have some time for Q&A right now. Just want to remind our audience, if there are any questions that are currently on the pigeonhole that you would really want answered, please vote. We will try to answer as many questions as possible. Currently, for our panelists, the most popular question so far we have is, what are the pros and cons of using an e-procurement platform available in the market? Anita, any idea about these e-procurement platforms?
I haven't really personally had much interactions with e-platforms, but I guess from an efficiency perspective, it might help the charities to move things along faster. And as we move along to digitalization, definitely this would be probably the way to go for larger charities as well. My only comment is that if you want to move into e-platform, do a risk assessment of what are the risks relating to this for your purchasing, right? And what are the controls you want to put in place? And if there are inbuilt controls that you can have, like approvals are automatically routed, documents are safeguarded and kept. So you want to be able to look at this, make sure that the controls are in there, and give yourself assurance that this is the platform that we want to go on. Yeah, I think it's really when we move into a new system, that's something that needs to be done and ties to us understanding what a platform is about. What are we going to do in it? We also want to have safeguards to prevent people from unauthorized access to information or unauthorized approvals. So these are just the kind of risks that could come about with e-platform transactions. Yeah.
So, I mean, in my experience working with different charities, going digital can really drive efficiency. It can transform the way a charity works, can transform the workload for the staff, especially when it comes to things like procurement. I think other things like HR, CRM. But coming back to the pros and cons, I think we need to be careful that looking at our staff and volunteers, there are some who are more tech savvy and some who are less. So that's one con, right? That change management is important. And actually a lot of organizations underestimate how much time and effort you need to have that change management to sit down and train, especially the less tech savvy staff and volunteers to use a new platform. Doesn't mean you don't do it, but we talk about procurement champion. Sometimes you need a change champion as well. Someone who will understand, take the time to understand the e-platform. And we're talking about procurement, right? Which e-platform do you use? You're going to go back to your procurement policy to say which one is better, what has better value for money. And that's a fairly long process.
Exactly.
And then the change management comes in where some people need to be handheld. So don't lose your volunteers and staff along the way because you're driving efficiency. I'm not saying don't do it. In fact, I think it's inevitable that every organization will have to move, will have to digitize. But manage your change well. Think of your staff, think of your volunteers.
So like members of the audience here have actually asked quite a number of practical questions. So they want to tap your brain on practices now. The most popular one, is there actually a threshold for tenders? Is there any guideline to say above a certain value I must go for a tender, or above a certain value I need X number of signatures? Anything like that, Anita?
I would say there's exactly guidelines, but I think if you look at the government procurement practices, more than 50,000 would require a tender to be undertaken. For charities, only the large charities usually have tender policies, okay, because they may be involved in larger value purchases across many centers. They may take on large renovations. It's a good question that has come to us as well. And our take to them is consider what kind of items is considered large value to you. So if you are going to do a revamp of your IT infrastructure, or if you are going to have renovation of a center, and it's going to be something that's so jarringly different from your average procurement, right? You may be around, let's say, 100, 200K a year, and then suddenly you're going to expend one single transaction of 50K to 100K. You want to look at that materiality level and then determine, maybe I should have a tender for this. Tenders have a lot of connotations behind it, a lot of controls. It requires resources, time, and you also have to make sure that you are able to do that as well. In terms of purchasing approval limits, as what I mentioned before, depends on your size. If you feel some charities may say $1,000, I need 3 quotes. Some small ones may say $500, I may need 3 quotes. And larger ones may say 10,000, I need 3 quotes. Really, it's for the board to sit down and determine where their risk comfort is, and then determine the values at which we want to get quotations and what kind of transactions come to the board based on value.
I pick up on what Anita has said about tenders, and I guess not only tenders, this also applies to a lesser extent to just plain vanilla quotations. But with a tender, your tender documentation is important. And we look at the principles earlier. You notice a lot of both the Singapore government, UN, and New Zealand, they talk about being fair to your suppliers, being transparent, having, in a sense, a level playing field. And I think for charities, a lot of us, when we start off, we don't quite realize how much work that actually takes. Because you get 3 quotes, you might be comparing apples to oranges, 3 suppliers, they all quote different line items.
Yeah.
With a tender, it's, let's say you're tendering to buy a piece of land or big IT infrastructure or construction work, it's even more chance for that happening. So actually having a proper tender documentation, as Anita alluded to, can be a lot of work. So the size of a charity or manpower, you got to think about who's going to sit down. You need to get a third party to come in to actually help you do up your tender specs, your tender documentation. If you're doing a construction project, very often we get a professional to come in to help us, whether an architect or QS or both, for example, to do up your tender documentation before it goes out to contractors. So, but why do we do that? I think part of that is to make sure that there's a level playing field. And then when the tender or the quotations come in, we are comparing apples to apples. Otherwise, for approver, it's really difficult. You have 3 quotations or tenders which are not properly done. It's very hard to assess because everyone puts different values and different things in there. So if you're going to go down the tender route, and to a lesser extent, even quotations, you need to think about this.
So we're regrettably running a little short on time, but we've got a really enthusiastic audience today. So I'll take the 3 questions with the highest votes right now. First question here. Do charities normally issue a debit card or a credit card to their staff for procurement? And if they do so, are there any safeguards that we need to put in place?
Actually, I just had a conversation with one of my team members today on this. We generally don't see credit cards being issued in charities itself, right? If you want to issue credit cards or debit cards, you have to have a policy on how you're going to manage this. You want to have limits, and you want to give guidance on what can the credit card be used for. And a lot of times it's used for payments for online purchasing platforms, right? And again, when we look at procurement, because the debit card and credit cards is the payment side, I've already spent the money, right? So if you're talking about procurement and you want to go ahead and buy something, you go online to an online platform and you look at something and you decide this vendor overseas gives me the best price. I've got a credit card, I get the approval and I go ahead and buy. The credit card itself just gives you the chance to make a payment on behalf of the organization. But when we come to the policies of principle as well, do you have any guidance that when you want to buy on e-platform, have you done comparisons with other online vendors, whether this purchase is good value? And how credible is this vendor that may be situated in another place that's offering you a good price? And what kind of justification are you going to make when buying on such platforms itself? Are you going to look at the reviews? Is that good enough? How much can I spend that I can just charge my credit card like that? So I would say it's not wrong, but you do need to consider how you want to use this and what is the messaging to the people who hold these credit cards. What kind of transactions can they charge? Because we always want to come back to the ultimatum is that once the money has been spent, we are obliged to honor it. And so we want to make sure that whatever we are obliged to honor, we actually approve the purchases to go through.
Yeah, I think a lot of wisdom there, but I would also say encourage charities to start thinking about this because we're going cashless, right? COVID has forced many charities to go from paying in cash and check to starting online banking accounts. And I don't know how many of you had the same experience as me as board members or staff queuing outside banks during lockdown to start an online account for PayNow. And as this happens more and more, I think cashless options will come to the fore. So we need to amend our policies.
Yeah.
So just Paul, this is for you. Do you think WhatsApp text is considered a proper supporting document of approval?
Yeah, I think ultimately you just need a record, right? That something is approved. If your policy says approval can be through WhatsApp, then your policy says that. But what I want to caution people is ultimately somebody has to print out and store. So for e-procurement, you can take photos and put everything onto a website, onto a web-based service, and then it keeps for you. If it's WhatsApp, if you have something that goes into a software and keeps for you, easy, right? But if your poor staff has to print every WhatsApp out and file it away or scan or take a photo and then upload it, email is easier. So basically, it might seem easy upfront, but it might cause a lot of work in the back room. So your policy should also consider what is the most efficient and easiest way, less sweat for the staff in keeping records.
Okay, one final question from our audience. With e-commerce platforms now, Shopee, Lazada, where you can actually find a wide range of products and a wide range of prices for actually the same product. It's actually really quite easy to get 3 quotes. But how do I actually ensure that I'm getting the cheapest ones? Do I have to go through that expense and effort?
I would say it comes back to the policy that you're going to set as well, right? So if you want to go and purchase on online e-platforms, right? So what kind of items can you buy? And again, it comes back to who are you buying from? And is this value for money? And is the vendor credible itself? And if you want to say 3 quotes, it's really how do you want to demonstrate to the approver that I've done this, right? So if you just look at online, like what Paul said, are you going to do screenshots and show that I've checked this, I've checked this, I've checked this? And I will always, again, like I say, if I'm approving a transaction, what is the best way that helps me make a decision whether we should go ahead or not? And am I happy to receive an email with 3 screenshots? Or will I ask questions like, who is this vendor? They're located in a country that I don't know. How do you know that we are actually going to be able to receive the services? So those are the things that need to be considered. Yeah.
So we're sadly out of time for today's session, but before we actually leave, I would just like to invite each of our speakers here to actually leave us with one key takeaway. Paul, something quick?
Understand the why behind your procurement policy and not only the how.
I think it's also a good opportunity to take a look at your policy and see whether it's adequate. It gives enough clarity based on some of the points that we have discussed today. And also check in with your staff whether they do fully understand what the policy is about. Because at the end of the day, as a charity, we are going to invite heightened scrutiny on our expenses and how we spend our money.
All right, so moving on. We would just like to invite the audience here to actually join in the annual Charity Governance Conference 2022 happening on the 8th to 9th of September 2022. You can actually attend physically at the NTUC auditorium to network with your fellow peers in the charity sector, as well as the esteemed speakers and panelists. You can also choose to attend the event virtually. Please scan the QR code to register now. And aside from this charity governance conference, I understand that the Law Society Pro Bono Services is actually planning a workshop in the coming months. All participants in today's webinar will receive an email invitation to sign up for it. So do stay tuned. And after this webinar actually ends, a feedback form will be shown in your browser for your completion. We appreciate if you could just take a couple of minutes to complete the form so that we can improve our webinars. Now, if your charity needs legal advice, please email us at assistnpos@lawsocprobono.org.sg, on behalf of the Law Society Pro Bono Services and the Singapore Corporate Counsels Association, we would like to thank Paul and Anita once again. And thank you, our audience, for actually joining us. And we hope that you have a great week ahead.